Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. Before the modern era and the arrival of gunpowder, there were three empires that expanded at remarkable speeds. By which I mean that within a single generation, they went from a tiny kingdom, if that, to empires dominating huge regions and populations. The earliest of these is Alexander the Great's empire, which was centered at Macedon. He became king of that kingdom in 336 BCE, and by 323 BCE, when he died, he ruled everything between Macedonia and roughly the border of India and Pakistan in the modern day. Then, chronologically speaking, the Rashidun Caliphate, which was centered at Medina in Arabia. The Rashidun caliphs were, well, not kings, but rather they were successors of Prophet Muhammad, a religious leader who had united the Arab tribes under the banner of a new religion, Islam. The Arabs were essentially nobodies from the desert that the Romans and the Persians didn't care about enough to even bother with. In fact, some later sources by the Romans and the Persians would later call them naked nomads on horseback. In 632 CE, they invaded the greater Middle East, and by around 656 CE, almost 24 years after they had started, they ruled everything between modern-day Libya and the border of modern-day Pakistan and Iran. The third and the final one is the Mongol Empire, centered at Mongolia. The Mongols were unified by Genghis or Genghis Khan, who turned them into a formidable force and conquered everything between China and Iran within his lifetime. Roughly from 1206 to 1227, the Mongols were led by Genghis Khan, but after his death in 1227, his sons and grandsons picked up the project of expansion. At their peak, around the year 1279, the Mongols ruled China, Central Asia, Iran, Turkey, Ukraine, and even some parts of Poland. It was the largest contiguous land-based empire ever. Now, what happened to these empires after they hit their peak? When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire was split into several kingdoms by his generals. The three main ones were the Antigonid Kingdom, centered at Macedonia and Greece, the Seleucid Empire, centered at Persia, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom, centered at Egypt. Now, after they were done fighting, these kingdoms went their own way, and by the year 30 BCE, they were all gone, consumed by the unstoppable tide of the Roman military. The Romans Latinized these lands, and then the Byzantine Empire made them Greek. Except for the Seleucid Empire, it was taken over by the Persians, who, Persianized it again. The Mongol army was defeated in its first major defeat at Ain Jalut in Palestine by the Egyptian Mamluk Sultanate. They continued to expand nonetheless, but Genghis or Genghis Khan's grandsons ended up at each other's throats, and the empire was divided into four. The Golden Horde, centered at the lower Volga region, today's southern Russia, I guess. The Ilkhanate, centered at Persia. The Chagatai Khanate, centered in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty, centered in China. By the year 1400, less than 200 years after the death of Genghis Khan, the successor kingdoms were pretty much gone. While the Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde remained in name, they were way past their peak. Now, while the successors of Alexander were able to do a pretty good job at maintaining their Hellenic cultural identity and were even able to spread it throughout their respective kingdoms, the Mongols admittedly failed at this. 3 of the 4 Mongol successor states ended up becoming Muslim. The Yuan dynasty in China basically gave up their Mongol identity and made an effort to be recognized as Chinese emperors. Mongolia, however, broke away and maintained its Mongol identity. It was also just a regional kingdom with little to no influence outside its borders. The Chagatai Khanate essentially Turkified, but they retained their Mongol identities to a certain extent for quite a while. The Ilkhans basically became Muslim Persians. They adopted Persian culture and pretty much assimilated. The Golden Horde also developed a mixed cultural identity, partly Mongol, partly Turkic, partly Persian, but all Islamic. The prestige of Genghis Khan and his dynasty remained for a long time. Formal Muslim dynasties tried to link themselves up to Genghis Khan in order to build themselves some legitimacy, but it's not a stretch to say that within about 100 years of their peak, the Mongols were taken over by local cultures and religions. However, the Caliphate of the Arabs turned out to be the most successful in this regard. Not only did they manage to get their religion dominant in their territory, but they were also able to create an identity basically out of nothing and spread it among their people. From Morocco to Iraq, the Arabic language reigns supreme even today, and the people call themselves Arabs. It's been 14 centuries, and the influence of the Caliphate can still be very clearly seen. It has not been rolled back by any outside forces, unlike the Hellenization efforts of Alexander's successors and the influence of the Mongols. Other than the Romans and the British, there hasn't been this much lasting influence left behind by an empire. We're gonna disregard the British here because they were a modern empire with steam engines and telegrams and stuff like that, but we'll talk about the Romans as we go along. Unlike the Romans and the Greeks, when the Arabs conquered the greater Middle East, they didn't really have a rich cultural or administrative heritage. They didn't even have a standardized written language. They didn't have senates and laws and centurions and tax collectors and scribes to keep records of all these things. Yet, they prevailed. So, what happened? How did the Caliphate succeed where others failed? Before we begin, let me tell you that this video is based mostly on my opinions, and it's not any kind of universal truth. You might disagree with it if you want. You have the right to do so. But do leave a comment on your thoughts because I'd like to hear them. So let's get started. All three of the empires I mentioned at the beginning were centered on a charismatic leader. Alexander inherited his kingdom, but he reorganized the military. Genghis Khan came from basically nothing and struggled through harsh terrain and tribal rivalries to unite fighting Mongol tribes. He tried to organize them into an empire with all the things that make empires run, such as a bureaucracy and a law code. Prophet Muhammad also came from basically nothing and united fighting Arab tribes under a new religion, Islam. Now already we see a big difference. Alexander's and Genghis Khan's troops were fighting for glory and country and gold, but the Arabs of Prophet Muhammad were fighting not for this world, but the next. So group cohesion was much stronger within these men. The term asbiya is used by 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun for group cohesion or solidarity that keeps people together. Now, of course, all three militaries fought valiantly and carried the day, so asbiya within all of them was pretty strong, which is why they conquered lands as far as they could. However, in many ways, that was the easy part. As the Mughal Shahanshah Aurangzeb Alamgir said, the greatest conquerors are not always the greatest kings. The nations of the earth have often been subjugated by mere uncivilized barbarians, and the most extensive conquests have, in a few short years, crumbled to pieces. He is the truly great king who makes it the chief business of his life to govern his subjects with equity. Anyone can conquer at the edge of a sword, but it is keeping those conquered lands together that's the real test. Alexander died quite young and had no clear successors, so the empire was immediately divided by his generals. Old factions that Alexander was keeping together came apart at the seams and claimed what they could for themselves. Genghis Khan died partway through his conquests, and his empire was also divided, unofficially, by 4 of his sons. Their 2 old rivalries that Genghis Khan had put down were popping up again. But ultimately, it was done in by cousins fighting each other. However, the Caliphate lasted as a single unit for almost a century after the original conquests. Even later on, it wasn't actually divided. It stayed as a single unit for some 2 centuries, and then its vassals started breaking away after a long decline. So why wasn't it divided? By all reasonable theories, it should have been. The Arabs that the Prophet had brought together had problems with each other, so why didn't they go to war with each other immediately? Well, first, They almost did. As soon as the Prophet passed away, Muslims became divided on who should succeed him. The factions were divided between the supporters of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, and Abu Bakr, a close ally of the Prophet. These factions would later develop into Shias and Sunnis, respectively. Abu Bakr became the first caliph or successor to the Prophet and took over the leadership of the Muslim community. Then there was the idea to divide the Prophet's territory between the people of Mecca and the people of Medina. The Prophet was originally from Mecca, but he had spent the last 11 years of his life in Medina and had passed away there. That was his capital. Additionally, Muslims from Eastern Arabia didn't really get along with Muslims from Western Arabia. Arabia is huge, so it's no surprise that these people were quite different from each other. So some of the tribes that the Prophet was allied with did walk away after his death, but Abu Bakr immediately dispatched armies against them and was able to keep his hold on Arabia. Then he turned his army against the Byzantine and Sassanid empires to the north, beginning the great Arab conquests. When the dust settled, the Arabs ruled all this territory. However, once these conquests slowed down, problems started appearing again. Not enough loot was coming in from the conquest, and as there was less to go around, people started to dig up old rivalries. This resulted in the assassination of Uthman, the third caliph, and a civil war between Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, and Muavia ibn Abi Sufyan, the governor of Syria and Uthman's cousin. So far, it looks pretty similar for all three empires. Arguing groups of people are brought together by a charismatic leader that then conquered large swaths of land and started infighting when the conquests slowed down. However, it is the civil war that changes everything. Rather, it's the end of the first civil war that changes everything. First, the generals of Alexander were all military leaders. They controlled aspects of Alexander's empires, and that gave them the right to claim power. Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons were also military generals, and they were descendants of the great Khan, and so that gave them the claim to power. However, after the death of Uthman, the only man who really had a claim to power was Ali ibn Abi Talib, based on his blood connection to the Prophet and his noted piety as a good Muslim. Keep in mind that Arab Muslims were united around a religion, and people who were stronger adherents to that religion had a higher status. However, Ali had basically no military experience to speak of at the start of the war in 656 CE. Not only that, but Ali's sons also had no military experience. Ali could only appeal to the Muslims in his empire, who were a very small percentage of the population. On the other side, Muavia was a capable general who had taken part in the original conquests, notably in Syria, and had ruled it as its governor for 20 years. His supporters were largely Syrian Christians who saw him as their leader, not because of his piety, but rather because of his military prowess and diplomatic skill. Muavia wasn't pious, but he had kept Syria in check. He had even married a Christian woman from a prominent tribe in order to get their support. So there was an imbalance of power there. And in my opinion, the first civil war could only have ended one way, with Muaviya's victory. In any case, Muavia didn't win, because Ali was killed by some rebels and his son, Al-Hassan, gave up his claim to Muavia. This kept the empire from being divided for now. Muavia then keeps the empire stable for 20 years as caliph. He starts to put a bureaucracy together and really builds up a skeleton of a state. He gives the state 20 years of rest where no major rebellions happen, and he keeps the Byzantine Empire to the north in check. But then he dies in 680 CE, and the whole thing breaks apart, and there's another civil war. The whole thing just repeats itself. Now, the rebels who killed Ali in 661 also wanted to kill Muavia. Let's imagine a world where they succeeded. Both Ali and Muavia are gone. So what happens now? There would be a crisis of leadership. Based on what happened during the Second Civil War just 20 years later, what would likely happen is that Ali would be succeeded by Al-Hassan, his eldest son, but Al-Hassan had no military or government experience, and he would likely have trouble keeping his supporters together. On the other side, the Syrian supporters of Muavia would probably choose another member of his family to carry the baton because his sons were quite young in 661 CE. Now, the Caliphate had a huge fault line running through it. Half of their territory was formerly Persian and half was formerly Roman or Greek. At the very least, the Caliphate would have been divided along that fault line. The Syrians would have kept Syria and probably Egypt as well, and Al-Hassan would probably have kept Iraq, Arabia, and Iran, along with the title of the Caliph. I think in this case, the Syrians would have no interest in the title of the Caliph, and they wouldn't have a claim either because Muavia never became Caliph in this timeline. It's only because Muavia became Caliph that later successors of his would claim the title in our real timeline. So the Caliphate in 661 maybe would have looked like this. From then on, it would become a matter of personal diplomacy to keep these empires together. In our timeline, it was Muavia himself who kept these regions together, so it would likely have to be Muavia's successor and Al-Hassan themselves who would have to hold this territory together. There was no state machinery to do this for them, so it would come down to these people personally, and that's a very tall order. Al-Hassan had no experience of such things, and likely neither would Muavia's successor. Even if he did, Muavia's successor would likely lack the 20 years of experience and trust that existed between Muavia and his supporters. So, in my opinion, what likely would have happened is that the whole thing would have crumbled. The Persians would have risen up in Persia, and Turkic tribes from Central Asia would have invaded Iran. You would have the barbarians at the gate problem that the Romans did. The Byzantines would have sent armies into Syria and helped Christian rebels there, and it would likely have been complete chaos. And this is not unfounded, because after Muaviya's death in our timeline, in the real timeline, these things actually happened. So now they would just be happening a bit earlier. Likely, once Islamic rule would have crumbled, would see Muslims being pushed into Arabia, and in my opinion, Islam would have been an Arab religion, not a global one. It would have been exactly what happened with Genghis Khan's empire, but on a much smaller timeline because the Muslim leaders did not have the same kind of experience that Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons had. We saw something similar happening with other empires. Attila the Hun's empire fell like that, and the later Demotic empire fell like that as well. There are many examples of disruptive empires that fell in a generation or two due to infighting and had not much impact. This would have been the fate of the Caliphate had Muavia died in 661 CE. In reality, Muavia kept the empire together for 20 years, and when he died, there was another civil war. Again, between a kinsman of Muavia and a pious Muslim who was connected to the Prophet. Muaviya's kinsman, in this case, Abdul Malik, wins the civil war and keeps the empire together. So, in summary, the first reason I believe that the Caliphate didn't break apart was because the civil wars weren't between two military leaders, but rather between a diplomatic governor and a pious Muslim with not much military experience. So, these wars were lopsided. Additionally, they were between one party supported by non-Muslims who were a majority of the empire's population and the other side being able to only appeal to the Muslim population, which was, well, quite small. Had these civil wars been between two military leaders of equal footing, would probably have seen them divide the Caliphate, likely along the Greco-Persian fault line. The second reason for the political unity of the Caliphate was the role of the Caliph himself. In Islam, God is the ruler of the universe, and it's only through him that someone can get the honor to rule. Prophet Muhammad was bestowed the honor to lead the Muslim community, and so were his successors. To become a ruler, you had to be bestowed that by the Caliph. So there weren't many contenders running around who could claim independent rulership. That's why for the first 120 years, there was only one independent ruler in all of Islamdom, the Caliph himself. The third and biggest reason, in my opinion, was Muavia. He kept everything together for 20 years, kept everyone happy, and got them used to being ruled by these new Arab Muslims. He didn't impose Islam on them, he didn't impose his language or anything else on them. He couldn't even get them to use his own coins. He had to copy the coins that had previously been used by them. On top of that, the Byzantine Empire was right there to exploit any weakness within the Caliphate. Muavia kept the pressure up on them as well. This was a very tumultuous time, and Muavia did very well in consolidating Muslim control over these formerly Persian and Roman territories. By the time he died, the generation of non-Muslims who had seen the conquest and who had been reluctant about being ruled by Muslims was largely gone. It had been 50 years since the conquest when Muawiyah died in 680. These 20 years were make or break for Islam, and thanks to Muawiyah, they made it. However, that's not the full story. Now, the Arabs didn't have a very organized culture. It was very much a tribal system that they had lived in so far. They didn't have bureaucracy and administrative systems that, for example, the Greeks and the Persians up north had. Neither did they have any kind of elaborate court cultures or imperial shows of extravagance that many kings needed to have. Many of the Arabs were nomads, after all. Muawiyah let the systems of the Greeks and the Persians work as they did before him. That was another way of getting the subject populations used to Islamic rule. So much so that Muawiyah had even gone to Christian holy sites at the event of his coronation to pay his respects to these preceding religions. History could have taken a very interesting turn at this point. Muawiyah and his successors could have just stuck to Greek. They could have delved into that established culture and sailed upon its waves. We could have seen a Greek Islam rather than a very Arab and Persian Islam. The reason that I say this is because, well, we've seen it so many times. Genghis Khan united the Mongols, but he couldn't really create a unified culture from scratch. He took the script of the Uyghur people, for example, and had it modified for Mongolian. Later, his descendants just gave up on Mongolian culture. Those in China became Chinese, those in Persia became Persian. Similarly, Greek and Roman cultures were richly developed, and wherever they went, they attracted locals because of their prestige. Arab culture wasn't like that. The thing the Arabs took most pride in was their oral poetry, and beautiful as it is, it's hardly a tool of government. So why did Arab culture become dominant in the Caliphate? After Muawiyah's 20 years of rest, there was another civil war, and this time Muawiyah's kinsmen, the Umayyads, won a clear victory under Caliph Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik was pivotal in the development of Arab culture. Since he had won a clear victory and shown his power, he decided to make sweeping changes to everything. Unlike Muawiyah, when Abdul Malik became caliph, he wasn't in Syria for 20 years. He'd grown up in Medina, studying Islamic theology with prominent figures. So he wasn't used to the Greek culture that reigned supreme in Syria. Where Muawiyah had appeased the Christians, Abdul Malik put an Islamic building on top of the Temple Mount to show Islam's dominance. He kicked out many of the Christians and Zoroastrians in the government and installed Arabs in their place. He made Arabic the official language of the Caliphate and started to develop a court culture that was uniquely Arab and gave patronage to Arab scholars and poets. He even started a project of recompilation of the Quran. Speaking of the Quran, it was a major reason behind the establishment of Arabic as the dominant language in the Caliphate. Slowly, the non-Muslim population was converting to Islam due to a number of factors. One of these factors was simply the fact that non-Muslims had to pay a higher tax called the jizya. In exchange, they were excluded from military service, but the military was actually a tool of social mobility itself. So people did want to take part in the military so that they could rise up in the ranks and change their lot in life. Also, given that Islam is a proselytizing religion, Muslim religious leaders actively preached Islam to non-Muslims. As a result, more and more people began converting to Islam. These new Muslims had to learn Arabic in order to read the Quran and say their prayers and perform their religious ritualistic duties. Basically, all religious duties in Islam are performed in Arabic. Unlike the Bible, the Quran is believed to be the verbatim word of God. So it couldn't be that Arabic could be sidelined in favor of translations the way that happened with the Bible, for example. Arabic had to be there. And since non-Arabs were learning Arabic anyhow, it could serve as the language of communication between the various subject groups of the Caliphate and the Caliph. Additionally, the Umayyads used to move people around. If an area was too troublesome, they would just move their trusted Arabs to the region in order to secure it. They did that in areas like Morocco and Central Asia. Central Asia in 750 CE was said to be the most Arab area outside of Arabia. In short, the Arabic language and the court culture of Abdul Malik were the central points of the Caliphate. And if you wanted to get anywhere in life, you had to learn Arabic, which wasn't much of a hassle because you probably already learned a bit as part of your religious education anyhow. By 750 CE, less than 50 years after Abdul Malik's death, the Arabic language and Arab culture were dominant in much of the Caliphate's territory. Persians, Greeks, Egyptians, everyone was styling themselves in Arab titles and names and using their knowledge of Arabic and Islam to improve their lot in life. Later on, as the Caliphate broke apart, new entities ruled by Muslims of different ethnicities started to pop up. In the East, the court culture of the Persian Sassanids was revived, and so Persian would become the dominant language in the Islamic East, especially east of the Greco-Persian fault line, but Arabic was still learned because, of course, religion. Additionally, Persian never really broke west of the Greco-Persian fault line, so those countries were, and are today, Arab in identity and language. If you don't count Turkey, that is. Turkey is very much Persianate. Another thing I'd like to add is that since the Muslim Arabs took over such a huge part of the Silk Road trade route, they started to trade with people. They went as far as China and India and Southeast Asia, and this helped them carry their religion and culture to foreign places. And so when the Turkic tribes of Central Asia invaded the Middle East, they had already converted to Islam. This could have resulted in something similar to the barbarian invasions of Roman territories, but it didn't. The so-called barbarians at the gate here were Muslim themselves, and many of them were even somewhat Persianized. So, to summarize, in my opinion, the Arab invasions and the Islamic Caliphate represent a unique blend of religion, culture, and imperialism. The Arab invasions took place at the hands of the new community of Arab Muslims who were united and held together by a new religion that promised them heaven in the afterlife and knit them together as a community with laws and practical daily rituals. They conquered and settled in new garrison towns away from established population centers, thereby making sure that they weren't too disruptive to the public and the systems left in place by former rulers. Also, where the Mongols conquered with fear, the Muslims tried the opposite. The Mongols made sure that towns that didn't surrender were obliterated. Their populations were massacred. This resulted in other towns being too afraid to resist. However, the Arabs didn't conquer like this. Rather, towns that surrendered were given favorable terms. Records were kept of how tribes and towns were conquered, and their future under the early caliphate was very much reliant on that. So other towns didn't feel too bad about surrendering. Then, 20 years of respite gave them a chance to stand on their own feet and begin to slowly establish their control. The fact that this empire came with a religion was a major factor as well. No other religious group has ever built an empire like this. Your lot in life was tied to your religion, something that happens to be very changeable, and that religion came with a language and a culture that just happened to be the language and culture of government. So even though non-Arabs could never be equal to the Arabs, they could still be part of the community and rise to very respectable positions. The Mongols, with them, brought no reasons for anyone to convert to their religion or culture. Their religion wasn't proselytizing, and their culture wasn't as richly developed as those of the people that they conquered. So they had to convert to the cultures of their subjects, not the other way around. Alexander's successors and the Romans did pretty well in this regard because their cultures were rich and carried a lot of prestige. The same became true of the culture of the Arabs. The influence and success of the Arab Islamic project is on par with the influence left behind by the Romans and the British. What makes the success of the Arabs even more impressive is that they did it without established institutions or any administrative heritage. By the time that the Romans and the British came around with their huge armies, conquering everything in their path, they had organized militaries, governments, and other systems in place. The Arabs had nothing of the sort. The Romans continued to live in our government institutions. The British continued to live in the language that I'm speaking right now, despite being born 8,000 kilometers away from Britain. The Arabs continued to live in the Arabic language that's spoken in 22 countries and the almost 2 billion people around the world who follow the religion of Islam. The only distinguishing feature that the Arabs had. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.